Join Lee Bellinger today on the Bellinger Report. Lee is the publisher of Off-Grid Confidential, one of the last information financial newsletters to be delivered 100% through the mail and completely independent of the internet and big tech scolds. Lee has been publishing continuously since 1988 and is your guide to off-grid living.
Hi, this is Lee Bellinger with the Bellinger Report, and I have a rather interesting conversation with Dr. James Giordano. He's the professor of neurology at Georgetown. He's a brain scientist and ethicist. He's works on the Neuroethics project, and he actually has a very lengthy resume here, including research fellow and task leader of the EU Human Brain Project, and he's worked with the the United States Department of Health and Human Services. He's done some work with DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. I don't get a chance to talk with fellows like you every day, sir. And you've written a number of books and white papers, 290 publications in neuroscience and neuroethics, 7 books, 15 government white papers, and ethics and biosecurity. And let's see here. I'm doing a little bit of reading here in recognition. So you've been elected to membership in the European Academy of Science and Arts, Overseas Fellow of the Royal Society of Medicine, and a number of other rather impressive achievements. So let's talk a little bit about what you'd like to talk about today, because I think I'd rather just hear what you have to say than what I have to ask. That's okay?
That's great by me. Thanks. And it's a real pleasure to be here. And thank you. And thanks also for your audience for tuning in. As you said in my very gracious introduction, I've been a brain scientist for 40 years this year. I've been doing brain science for 40 years. And it's been a really wonderful journey. I've looked at it as a final destination. And the reason for that is that when I first came into the field some 40 years ago, there were literally four programs in the United States that were titularly dedicated to the brain sciences. Now, there were plenty of other academic programs at the graduate level that dealt with anatomy, physiology, pharmacology, chemistry, neurobiology. But this field called neurosciences that created kind of this conciliant group, a merger of these various disciplines in the physical sciences, life sciences, social sciences, that then address these long-standing questions of the humanities about the nature of mind, the nature of self, identity, what is it to think, really posing the Cartesian question of, I think, therefore I am, but then what does that make me, given the fact that I have an embodied and embedded brain that's nested in these ecologies? And how do I think? So the field of neuroscience sort of came to life around the same time that I was very fortunate enough to be placed into the field back in the early 1980s, late 1970s. And it's been a very interesting journey for me because along that period of time have been some incredibly sentinel technological developments. Building off the momentum of the Human Genome Project, we've gotten into molecular neurosciences and able to understand the genotypic and phenotypic interactions that are important to establishing structure and function of the brain. But the toolkit, that's really the thing that has been amazing, truly amazing. What we find is that in many sciences, brain science is no different, there's an interesting dance. There's kind of a tango, right, of the tools we have and the theories we develop. We have certain, what I'll call primitive tools, and inherent tools of observation, of the way we can palpate and engage the world. And we use those to establish theories, ideas about how things work. And then we get to the limit of that, and we want to know more. So what we do is our theories prompt the development of iteratively more capable tools, which then tests our various theories, validates some, invalidate others, and expands our knowledge base. So this interesting tango, and I call it a tango specifically because I think if you really look at good Argentine tango, I mean, there are certain things that one partner does to lead, but the following partner is equally as beautiful and very often makes the lead look very, very good. Here too, the tools we're using are making the theories look good, and the theories we have are spawning ever more capable and less constrained and more sophisticated tools. So this is the thing that has really impressed me and has really allowed, I think, the brain sciences to make ardent strides over the past 40 years. And certainly we've seen an almost explosive growth of the brain sciences in using these technologies over the past 20 odd years to be able to assess the brain, access the brain, and like humans always do, the things that we assess and we access, we try to affect. And, being a little colloquial and not too performative and too science fiction-y, what we're really doing is we're getting a lot of data from the brain and its functions, and we're reading these data and we're providing meaning to what these data are. In other words, we're literally reading information about the structure and function of the brain. You want to take a colloquial jump, that's mind reading per se. And that's one of the goals. Can we use these technologies to be able to intuit, gain insight, in some cases, even directly decipher the signals that the brain is doing? That's our thoughts, our ideas. But then over above that, can we also use these technologies to affect the brain in those ways that may be able to mitigate certain disease and injury states, be able to affect, for example, certain congenital conditions or the general decrement that occurs with our neurological and cognitive capability as a consequence of the lifespan? And can we be even more directional in some cases, being able to utilize the brain sciences to affect our health, various protections and the various things we occupy ourselves with, whether it's vocationally or avocationally, and or to be able to enable ourselves to do things that we haven't done before. Interesting acronym.
Could I ask a question?
Sure.
We were discussing before we came on the air that I had a conversation recently with Martin Cooper, who's 93, very healthy 93, by the way. Mm-hmm. And I asked him this question. I said, what was on your mind when you invented the cell phone? And of course, it was to help police. In those days, they only had radios in cars, and the police could not go interact with the general public in real time and communicate in real time and help them in real time. And I said, what motivated you to create this technology? And he said, well, that's really a dumb question because he told me it was a dumb question. He said, the purpose of technology is always to improve the human condition. And he said, that's really the only reason for doing it. He said, that's why it's done. That's what matters most. That's kind of transformative technology. So let me ask you this question. So along these lines, you don't think artificial intelligence is real yet in terms of sentience? We're nowhere near that quite yet. Is that correct? Do you believe that statement?
In part. So
we know that they have advanced algorithms that are built on algorithms, but that isn't necessarily thought.
But it's difficult to actually say that. And let me be very, very clear. So, obviously there's a video component to our broadcast today as well as an audio component. And I want you to take a really good look at me. Just take a peek. Now, I know great radio, so that notwithstanding. But do you know whether or not I'm sentient just by looking at me? You don't. What you're doing is you're comparing me to you. You say I look relatively human, although somewhat troll-like around the edges. And you say, all right, since I'm human and you're human, then this guy must be like me. Ergo, you're thinking, I'm thinking, we're good to go. The issue really becomes that our thoughts, unless we express them in some way or communicate them, are wholly subjective. And they're transparent only to me because my brain, like my neurological system, is embodied with me. So the key is the interaction piece, either in some form of communication or in some form of sensing. So this is a little bit of the growing mystery of AI, and AI and neuroscience interface on a number of different levels. But I think one of the key levels is what I would call the primitive question or the primordial question. How much hardware, if you will, is it necessary to run the program? If the program is sentience, if the program is consciousness. What we've learned through the brain sciences is that heretofore, what we thought were very simple organisms and organisms that didn't have particular capacities of thought, emotion, feeling, behavior. Now we recognize it's not just the number of cells that they pack into their nervous system, but the relative complexity of the hierarchy, the structure, the architecture of those cells and what they do with them. In other words, organisms sort of make the most out of what they've got to be able to be as effective as they can within whatever their environment is, which goes back to the previous quote about what we do is try to improve our condition. And I don't really care if you're a lobster, a crab, a crayfish, a fish, a hawk. Your nervous system has evolved to allow you to be successful in the environments in which you exist. So really, you have to ask an age-old philosophical question. What's it like to be a bat? What's it like to be a horse? I don't know because I don't have that hardware. I can't literally see the world through your eyes or feel the world through Lee's experience. The same holds true here for these systems, these computational systems and analytical systems that we develop. At what point does the system literally go over, quote, the edge? In other words, the edge of self-experience. What types of architectures of hardware, software, programs are necessary to create the type of networked capability in which that particular system begins to develop even a primordial level of consciousness? A few years back, I wrote a paper for the Artificial Intelligence Journal talking about the possibility and probability of sentient machine systems. And really, if you begin to think about it, once a system be able to generate some idea of what is it versus not it, I mean, a simple distinction of this is not part of me or this is part of me, well, that is a very fundamental sense of self. A number of years ago, I had the great pleasure of working with what was then one of my graduate students and now a very, very accomplished professor named Dr. Jeremy Purcell. And we explored that question in a series of presentations and papers about the nature of the self. In other words, the semblance of self, what it takes. And I tell you, at this point, I think that there are probably types of artificially intelligent machine systems that are developing the capabilities whereby the system is aware of certain aspects of itself, but we don't have access to that. In other words, the system is not communicating that to us, or we're not assessing that because it's an artifact of whatever that machine system is doing. The question then becomes, at what point does the artifact become the actualization of that system? And it's sort of an evolutionary developmental question, an evo-devo question. And in some ways, I think it's fascinating because it may help to teach us how it is that we or other mammals developed sentience, conscience, etc. But then it also becomes important to consider what it means for those animal systems to have that capability, and perhaps artificial systems or silicon systems to have that capability.
Silicon, yes. So I want to make a segue, just that we have a limited time, and this is obviously a hugely interesting subject. I want to talk about potential application of what you're talking about. And one of the things I look at that I find to be extremely archaic is, for example, our penal system. I look at our penal system and we lock people up because, in essence, there's a certain percentage of the population, for whatever reason, their brains are either primordial, something primordial about them is snapped on that most of us have snapped off, and that it could result in violence and destruction and a lot of other social maladies. And we don't have a better system than putting them in prison. And prison seems so archaic to me. Is it possible that we could make a breakthrough where if somebody were sentenced to a serious crime, that we might be able to give them the option of reprogramming some of those detrimental elements that we would consider in society to be detrimental, meaning like some people simply do not have the ability to control a propensity toward violence. Some people are just predatory. They're cannibals. They're people, and it's not, I'm not even making a moral judgment about it. I'm merely saying that I consider those in modern society to be defects, even though they might have been useful at another point in our development. And then there's a certain number of people, this is just my personal belief, there's a certain percentage of people that are prone to violence because their animal instincts are still turned on or they haven't been turned off. Let me ask you about the potential for that. I mean, let's put aside the civil libertarian arguments for a moment, and I'm just asking you scientifically, just completely independent of the ethics of it. Is it possible? Is it a logical application that we might see at some point?
We've already done it. I mean, the idea of utilizing various chemicals to control individuals' behavior and dictating that by some measure of punitive retribution or social control, we've been there.
We've been doing that, yes.
The idea of state-ordered leucotomies and lobotomies, we've been there, certainly.
But we left that one. We left that one behind.
We did because it was quite crude. And what we recognize is that although the end result was certainly in decreasing the undesirable behavior, there were a whole host of other things that went on that were equally undesirable for a variety of levels. And you really can't, nor should you, dissociate the enterprise with its ethics. But this is an interesting question, because let me circle back around to the ethical component. It really depends on how a group of people, a culture, a collective, a political or social body, define the good. If the good is complete social conformity, then realistically, anything that adds or contributes or stabilizes and sustains said social conformity could be viewed as a collective good. And although at least at face value, that seems to be acceptable, what it really does is it creates a power dynamic, and that would be very, very asymmetrical. Who has the power of decision? This gets us into a very interesting area of the brain sciences that is generally considered to be neurolaw, the use of the brain sciences in law and how laws affect the various uses of the brain sciences. And I must tell you, I mean, this is a very, very rich field that has an international cadre of scholars dedicated to it. But one of the areas in full transparency where my particular research group has engaged this field is in those things that may be viable for public safety, public security, and national security, irrespective of whatever nation it may be, considering that different nations have different ideas, philosophies, values, and perhaps ethics and laws. So the question then becomes, as you led off with, the sort of the preceding statement, was the penal system, at least here in the United States, is viewed as at least inefficient, if not in some cases ineffective, and in many cases burdensome, not only on the individuals who are in it, but on the society. Is it really corrective, and or is it simply just sequestrational? And as a consequence, you're really creating a hotbed for subsequent criminal activity, et cetera. So one of the questions that has come up is whether or not the neurosciences could be used in ways that are, quote, neurocorrective. Now, that opens Pandora's jar. And this is something that we're dealing with, both on the scientific side and the ethical side. I had the great pleasure of working with a student of mine whose name was Mercedes Sinat. And she coined the phrase ethics for Pandora. In other words, if you're going to open that jar, not only do the goodies come out, because these are the things you're trying to achieve or aiming to achieve, which is some level of social stability, reduction to volatility of violence, but the gremlins and goblins come out. Who decides who gets what? Is consent important? Even in some levels of consent, are you engaging some level of implicit, if not explicit, coercion? And then, although we like to think of ourselves as essentially operating within an open democracy and liberal society, which is in fact, at least on premise, the case here in the United States and among many of our international colleagues and collaborators, this is not a universal form of political oversight in government. So once you give governmental control to be able to then utilize the brain sciences to assess individuals' behaviors and thoughts, and what I mean by that is linking these within a larger paradigm of how they're using social media, how various communications and how particular patterns of their genetics and or taking samples of their biological functions in time may be correlated to various acts that are socially or legally inapt or violative. The question then becomes, could we use these forms of brain sciences in a descriptive and predictive way to describe what is norm or abnorm and what has particular dispositions and tendencies toward abnormality, volatility to violence, aggressiveness? And then could we also utilize these as correlative indicators in a predictive way? A number of years ago, I had the great pleasure of writing a paper with some colleagues, one of the most notable being the attorney James Falwell. And the title of the paper was Deliver Us from Evil on the Potential Viability, Value, and Problems of Assessment Neurotechnologies for Public Safety. And, it had a sniff of the Tom Cruise movie Minority Report. Could we assemble neurological...
Not to mention Clockwork Orange.
Oh, well, exactly, because there are two parts go along with it. The first is the descriptive and predictive part. And then once you identify those individuals who are, if you will, repeat offenders, and again, I had a wonderful benefit of working with a dear colleague of mine named Dr. Karen Herrera Ferra, And we have a series of papers about recurrent violent behavior and what might be the neurocognitive markers for that, but then what should you do about it? And are you crossing a line? Could you then use these forms of neuroscientific methods and tools to assess individuals' thoughts and behaviors, or at least the way certain measures of their thoughts or interactions are contributory to their behaviors? And could you then literally order them, or at least request to them with their consent in those ways that are going to get them particular social benefits, the ability to have indwelling devices that may be able to monitor certain levels of activity? This is not science fiction. Please understand, we're at a point right now where you can utilize various forms of deep brain stimulation to not only sense the brain state, but to affect the brain state. And this has been considered, and in some cases has been utilized on a trial basis, to affect individuals with addictive behaviors and addictive disorders. So
so you could help an alcoholic.
Well, yeah, you can help an alcoholic.
In other words, so because they have a propensity toward addiction that for reasons that others have less of.
Correct. And one of the interesting parts of these technologies
could save millions of lives
is they've developed to a point to be both closed loop, where it's actually sensing changes in the brain activity level, which would then turn the device on and then modulate that brain activity. In other words, decrease, if you will, hunger for drug, alcohol, gambling, sex, or even violence. And the other issue is it can be yoked and linked to a cell phone and a GPS, whereby if the individual is in what we consider to be a high recidivistic neighborhood or environment, you're going to pump up the volume of that level of neuromodulation so they can resist temptation based upon where they are geographically. Yeah. That spills a cornucopia of control-related problems, right?
Jeffrey Dahmer deeply regretted, he was killed in prison, but he deeply regretted what he did. I think it was sincere. And he acknowledged, he said, I have to be in prison because left to my own devices, I'll do it again. I'll kill again. And I can't stop it. I can't control it. He had no reason to lie at that point because he was never going to see the light of day again. And, I just think about guys like that, didn't want to be that way. They had a conscience somewhere, but it simply overrode any constraints that would hold them within the guardrails of social norm.
So the legal scholar and cognitive scientist Nita Farahani, working with our mutual colleague Hank Greeley at Stanford, has put forth the idea of something called cognitive liberty. And I like the idea. In other words, is our cognitive space the last liberty that we have, the freedom to think our own thoughts? And I don't disagree with that. The problem becomes when those thoughts are generative to those actions that harm others. And in some cases, also harm ourselves. Please understand there's also equal consideration of using the brain science as an assessment way to assess individuals and monitor individuals who are at high risk of suicidality and then decreasing their suicidal impulsivity. So the question then becomes not can we use the brain sciences in, quote, neurocorrective ways, but should we or shouldn't we? And if we should, who decides how we should? And can we always do the things we should, or once that cat is out of the bag, or to go back to the prior analogy, once Pandora opens that jar and those expected goodies come out, the reason we open the jar is because we're looking to gain the benefit of those goodies in terms of improving the human condition, decreasing the burdens, risks, and harms of the human predicament, making our world a safer place for kin and kith. Well, is my good the same as yours? What I define to be good, is that identical to yours, not only locally, regionally, internationally? And then what goes into that? And so, although we open Pandora's jar to be able to access the goodies, very often the goblins and goonies come out as well, and we have to deal with that. We must deal with that.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because it looks to me like at least half the population is susceptible to the siren call of the state, and I refer to them as coercive utopians, meaning they have a vision for altering humankind, but of course there's a diminution of individual rights in any such experiment. And
I don't disagree with you. I mean, as you say, I think any approach to utopia must consider utopia's potential to be dystopian, at least for some.
At the same time, We do have laws that say you can't drive a car when you're drunk. These restrict your choices. We do have things, we frown upon airline pilots who drink and fly. There's some things that appear to be rather easy to agree on.
Mm-hmm.
Laws against murder in general, everybody seems to agree with them. Taking another life, creating a civil system for settling disputes, going outside that system exposes you to criminality and, things that humans can understand and grasp. But at the same time, you're talking about the potential to improve the human species. And the question becomes, do we have the wisdom to do that? And, the wisdom and the knowledge to do that. I wish I had more time to talk to you today about this. I want to close with a question, a surprise question.
Sure.
And see how you do with it.
Okay.
Do you believe that there is a human soul? Can you reconcile that with science?
I think it depends on their definition of a soul. Right? Let me explain what I mean. Do I think that there is sort of some amalgamated force that develops with us as we develop that is intrinsic to our embodiedness and our prior experience, that utilizes our memories, is prospective in our hopes and our dreams, and that sort of defines us as us? I do. In terms of questions of relative immortality of such a thing, the transferability of such a thing, those are transcendent questions. And I think that each and all should be allowed their beliefs about those things that we simply don't have the tools to understand.
Not yet.
Not yet. But I do think...
But every thought in your brain creates an atomic and subatomic signature that's unique. That means that eventually we're going to be able to measure that in real time and develop a language, a binary language out of that. So tied to how a synaptic function actually happens, how a chemical reaction happens, they would all have to have a subatomic signature that are unique. I'm just saying. I'm not saying that we're going to do this within the next 1,000 years, but, given the rate at which technology is developing, who knows?
I think we'll do that in far less than the next 1,000 years, to be sure.
Probably.
And then the question is, well, what does it mean when we get that information and what will we do with it? And that's the 64 gazillion billion dollar question, right?
Of course. Well, that's a great answer. So I'd be frankly like to do another interview with you at some point to go into some of these issues, give ourselves a little more time.
Sure.
Maybe what I would do is I would give you a heads up on some of the questions I'd like to ask you. Like I said, we rarely get to talk to a DARPA guy.
Former, right? And I was just a consultant.
They're all former, aren't they? You're all former. None of you are current. Don't you? You don't watch enough bad science fiction. I can see that you have a problem with that. So, would you like to share any contact information or a heads up on your newest book with our guys?
Sure, absolutely. They can reach me at my university email. That's James.Giordano, Giord, as in Delta, A, N as in November, O, at georgetown.edu. And since you've asked, here's a part of the broadcast that's the unabashed self-promotional plug. I actually have second editions of a couple of my prior books that are forthcoming in 2022. COVID put a little bit of wrench in the timeline of those works. And very excited to have a new volume that will be coming out with my dear colleague, Dr. Roland Benedictor, talking about the effect of neurosciences on global culture. And so just a heads up, looking for that sometime during 2022, depending on how fast I can get my fingers moving on the keyboard.
Well, we'll be sending you a follow-up email, and I hope that we can talk some more. I'll definitely acquire your book in 2022 when it comes out. I hope you got the simple version, like maybe the Cliff Notes or something. I'll have to read those, but that'll be sufficient to at least pose a couple decent questions, I hope.
Great.
So this is Lee Bellinger with the Bellinger Report, Dr. James Giordano, and I want to thank you for your time today, and I do look forward to talking with you in the near future. I will be asking you for another interview.
Thank you.
We really didn't get to cover all that much today, but I appreciate your time, and thank you very much.
Thank you.